Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I'm Cody Goodwin, and joining me today, Mike Rodak. Mike, how are we doing?
Doing good. 2 more days until kickoff of the biggest game that I've covered in that stadium since 2019, LSU and Alabama. It's definitely and going back even further, maybe in terms of non-conference games in that stadium. So it's a big one, and I think everybody's looking forward to it.
I think, and we'll talk about this on today's show. You wrote a story today about Alabama's receiver situation. We'll dive into that in a moment. But one line you used there, biggest non-conference game of the Saban era, which I read that and got goosebumps. And it's like, oh man, this is going to be a fun game. We'll talk plenty about Alabama, Texas. Going to be a good one. Probably the game of the week on the week 2 slate in college football, set for 6 p.m. Saturday at Bryant-Denny Stadium. But before we get to the actual game itself, wanted to look back at some of the news of the week and really wanted to start here. Dropped a story this morning, Mike, Bama 247, that looked at Alabama's receivers. Lot of interesting little nuggets of information there. Wanted to start here, something that we've all kind of known. Last season was the first since 2017 that the Crimson Tide did not have a 1,000-yard receiver. If you go by receiving yards, Jermaine Burton led the team with only 677 yards. Lowest total for an Alabama leading receiver since Marquise Mays finished 627 in 2012. If you go by receptions, it was actually running back Jahmyr Gibbs who led the team with 44. And that's also the lowest total for an Alabama leading pass catcher since Julio Jones recorded 43 in 2009. So those are some jarring numbers for a school that's produced guys like Julio Jones, Amari Cooper, Calvin Ridley, Jerry Jeudy, Jalen Waddle, Devonta Smith, Jamison Williams, who transferred in from Ohio State, but still. And it becomes an interesting topic of conversation, as you so aptly wrote, ahead of this Saturday's game, because Texas has some really good pass catchers, right? Xavier Worthy, A.D. Mitchell, who transferred in from Georgia, Jordan Whittington, Jatavion Sanders at tight end. So, Mike, I wanted to start here, kind of a two-part question. What sparked your interest in looking into a story like this? And then also, what did you learn as you researched and talked to people throughout the reporting?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that when I was watching the Texas game last year, the Alabama Texas game, I was on paternity leave, so I wasn't at the game, but I was watching from home, and
Always on the grind.
yeah, it was one where offensively Alabama looked so challenged in that game, and it wasn't as if Texas had the 85 Bears defense. It just seemed like from a wide receiver standpoint, they weren't getting open, they weren't getting downfield. There wasn't the explosive passing game that for the first 3 or 4 seasons of me covering the team had been so commonplace. I remember my first season was 2019, and one of the first games I covered was New Mexico State. Terrible opponent, but you watch Jerry Jeudy run 85 yards, take a slant and take it to the house. Next week, I think it was South Carolina, Henry Ruggs, slant over the middle, 75 yards to the house. Like, that's what I was used to watching. And it was much different watching, even with Bryce Young, who had just won a Heisman, that game in Austin last year, trying to get things working with, Gibbs out of the backfield, who was a good receiving option for him. But, Trayshawn Holden was catching passes. Brooks, had just started the second season. Burton was in the mix. I think he had 2 catches for 10 yards in that game last year. They look so challenged. And that really continued, to certain extents. There's games where the receivers, I think, had better games than others. But even the Tennessee game, I remember looking at some stats during that, and that was, third Saturday in October, middle of the season, basically. And their numbers were so far off from where the receiving numbers were through 7 or 8 games the couple years prior. And it's a problem because that's kind of how they designed that offense, and that's something Nick Saban talked about time and time again. Like, he changed his offense. He felt like that's how you needed to win in college football, was quarterback and the passing game, and that's where they were recruiting really well for a while. And again, why was it all changing in 2022? And a lot of those questions carried over into this offseason, into this season, because it's basically the same group of personnel. You do add Malik Benson, you add some freshmen, and Jalen Hale and Jaron Hamilton and Cole Adams, but overall, it's the same group of players, and so they're going to need to be better. I think if you're going to win a national championship in this day and age, you still need a passing game, and this team needs to take a step forward. So that was really the the crux of the story is that this is a game where you're going up against, like you just mentioned, Texas has dudes at wide receiver. Xavier Worthy, who Nick Saban just said the other day is, an outstanding receiver, probably one of the best in the nation. I don't know if you can say that about Jermaine Burton. I don't know if you can say that about Corey Brooks. I don't know if you can say that yet about Isaiah Bond or about Malik Benson or about Kobe Prentice. And this is an opportunity for them on a really big stage to show some of that. Granted, you're not doing it with Bryce Young anymore. You're doing it with Jalen Milroe, and there's a host of other questions that come along with that. So that's kind of where they are, and it's obviously more reliant on the transfer portal. They hit on Jamison Williams. They did not hit on Tyler Harrell. I think Jermaine Burton was an iffy hit last year. Did not do much against Texas, did not do a whole lot against Tennessee, did not do much against LSU. I think his best two games are really towards the end of the year. The Auburn and Kansas State games, he started to show something, and then he carried it over into this first game against Middle Tennessee. But as Nick Saban said after the game, it's one thing to separate against those defensive backs and a different thing to separate against Texas's. So that's the main, and not that they're going head to head, but I think the passing game of Texas compared to the passing game of Alabama in this game is one of the big side-by-side comparisons that I'll be watching, because if Texas is able to do what they were doing in early in that game last year, and Alabama's not able to continue doing what it's capable of doing or what it was capable of doing under Bryce Young, then it could be a tougher game for them to win.
Absolutely. One of the things I really liked about the story, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in the show notes. So if you're listening on podcast or if you're watching on YouTube, go click, check it out. Got to be a VIP. So, hey, subscribe to Bama 247 while you're there. But one of the things I really liked about this story, Mike, is that you kind of went into detail about possible reasons why Alabama maybe saw a drop off in receiving production, coaching, recruiting, the transfer portal. That was literally the order of how you wrote them in the story. Is that maybe how you'd rank them, or which do you think is maybe the biggest factor? I know you talked about the transfer portal, about guys, leaving and coming in. What'd you kind of learn, from that, in talking to people, like which do you think is the biggest issue?
Yeah, probably the opposite order from that. I don't think coaching is having a big impact. I think Nick Saban has a lot of respect for Holman Wiggins. Wiggins was here when Devontae Smith was here, and he won a Heisman. He was here when Jalen Waddle and Jamison Williams was here. He's developed those guys really well. He's their second highest paid coach. He's been extended. I think that certainly shows a lot of respect and admiration on Saban's part. And I think people will probably point to Bill O'Brien too last year, but Bill O'Brien was also the coordinator 2 years ago, and went up against Georgia's defense in the SEC championship. And Jameson Williams had a huge day, and that was kind of the best game I think that Bill O'Brien called. So I think there were questions about O'Brien's play calling last year, but I don't think coaching is the biggest issue that goes into this wide receiver issue, if you will. Recruiting is part of it. And that's what I got into as far as, the 2021 class was the big one where Alabama missed. Ja'Cory Brooks, I think for a while seemed like a hit. He had that big Iron Bowl 2 years ago as a freshman where he had the touchdown catch to tie the game with seconds left. And then he came out pretty strong last year. But just did not seem to have a great fall camp this year, was suspended for the first half of that Middle Tennessee State game. Where does he stand right now? He might be their fourth receiver, fifth receiver, third receiver. We'll have to see kind of where he fits in on Saturday, but it seems like he's lost a little bit of ground. And then he was their best recruit that year. And this is his junior year. Like, this is the year he should really be making his move. And then the other three are gone. And Ajay Hall, who was just a spectacular failure in terms of a guy with a lot of off-field personality type of issues with him and his approach. And I remember the A-Day game 2021. He had a huge game, was making all these acrobatic catches, and a lot of people were excited about him. And then he started to get disgruntled during the year because he wasn't playing and was going on social media about it. And Saban was getting irritated when we were asking about him, and he gets suspended for a game and then comes back, and all of a sudden he's playing the national championship game because Jamison Williams and John Mechie are hurt, and has a big catch in the national championship game, and then he drops a touchdown. I mean, it's just whiplash with that guy. And then ended up getting suspended the following spring, leaves school, goes to Texas, gets arrested at Texas, gets suspended by Texas, leaves Texas, and he's nowhere right now. So that was a big miss. And that was, a player who I think, again, he would be a junior right now. That would be, if they had hit on him, a pretty big piece of their puzzle. Christian Leary was another one that year. And, more of a speed guy, but didn't really play too much his first 2 years. And he's gone as well. And there's players from the previous class too, Trayshawn Holden and Tyu Jones Bell, who are also gone, and those are still pretty highly recruited players too. So it's recruiting, I think, is part of it. And the 2021 class was tough because of COVID and because of all the restrictions on camps and visits and all that. And that's part of what we talked about in the story was it's a little bit tougher to evaluate guys. But the third and final factor that I think is probably the biggest is still the portal, because you're not able to develop these guys or keep them in your program to develop them, get them straight. Maybe they could have kept Ajay Hall. And he was kind of pushed out the door to some extent, but there's the way it was a few years ago. A guy might not have a great first year, might have a great second year, but he was still going to be on campus and you could still continue to work with him. Those guys are gone now after a year or after 2 years. And that's really been the case with their receivers. And that's something Saban's talked about, how much it's affected their depth. And, your starters next year are your backups right now, but your backups right now are leaving to become starters right now. And they can do that at other schools like JoJo Earl, another one from that 2021 class is, at TCU right now. So you have to get guys through the portal, and they've tried doing that. And Williams was a big hit, and Tyler Harrell was not. And that's, again, if Tyler Harrell had a big year last year, we probably wouldn't be talking about this right now. So you got to still hit on either, it's like the NFL, you got to hit on your draft picks or you got to hit on free agency. And I'd say for a couple year stretch there for Alabama, they didn't do either.
Absolutely. One of the things I noticed just kind of looking up, stats that you brought into the story and just kind of looking up a few other things here and there is, and even from coming in from Big Ten country, really only kind of casually watching Alabama, they've always had a dude that they could just spam to in the passing game, right? Whether it's Julio, whether it's Amari Cooper, Calvin Ridley, and then, from 27 on, it was, Jerry Jeudy, had Jalen Waddle, Devonta Smith, John Mechie. Last year, it didn't seem like they had a guy that they could just, get open, we'll get you the ball type receiver. And still way too early to tell if that guy is going to emerge or develop this year. But last week's season opener against Middle Tennessee, Isaiah Bond led all Alabama receivers with 5 catches, 76 yards and a touchdown. Jermaine Burton, 362 and 1. Tight end Amari Niblack had 249 and a touchdown. Kobe Prentice had 3 catches. 8 total pass catchers recorded a reception in the opener. Mike, if you had to guess, and again, way too early to tell if any of these guys will hit 1,000 yards, but who do you think is the most likely candidate for Alabama if, one of those guys is going to be 1,000-yard receiver this year?
I think Bond has the most potential, not to totally write off Burton or Brooks at this point, but, I think it's going to take a lot, especially with Milroe at quarterback. I don't know if they'll have a 1,000-yard receiver this year, but I think you do make a good point that even, back in the days of, let's play joyless murder ball and run the ball all day. Like they still had guys at receiver. I mean, Julio Jones was a high NFL draft pick. Amari Cooper was a high NFL draft pick. And he was kind of at that period where they were transitioning under Lane Kiffin. But they still had those guys. So I know a lot of people look at this year as Alabama's going to move back to running the ball, which, I think is all indications are they're going to do that to some extent. But it doesn't mean you can just erase the wide receiver position off the face of the earth. And you still need either one guy who's really a lead and reliable, or a few guys who, can do some different things and, kind of put some stress and some defenses down the field. They didn't have a lot of that last year. And so you're asking about who was their go-to? I mean, it was Gibbs out of the backfield for Bryce Young a lot of the times, or it was Cameron Latu in the red zone at tight end. And, I think Gibbs obviously impressed. The Lions took him 12th overall and what he was able to do, but it's hard to really threaten a defense with a running back being your main pass catcher. It's tough to do. You need some guys to push the ball down the field. They didn't have that. And I think the tight end issue too is not to be forgotten here, because there was a few years here where the tight end was just not part of the offense, and that's because they had such strength at wide receiver. Um, but accordingly, they didn't recruit all that well, among tight ends. And then you have schools like Georgia that are picking up Brock Bowers, or even Texas with Jatavion Sanders, and the better tight ends are elsewhere. So Amari Niblack is, I think, the guy who has the most potential in that room. We saw a little bit of that with his catch against Middle Tennessee. He had one catch last year for a touchdown, and he's the most athletic, and maybe can provide some of that to them. They recruited better at tight end going into next year's class, with Caleb Odom, but it's still. If the better tight ends at Georgia and the better wide receivers are at Texas or A&M or LSU or Ohio State, then Alabama needs to be better somewhere else. And they're not better at quarterback right now than anybody else. I don't think they're better at offensive line than anybody else. And their defense is potentially very good, but I don't know if it's better than Georgia's. So it's like, where are you better? Where are you? Can you just line up on any given Saturday and beat the team because you have the team that you're playing because you have better players at that position or on that side of the ball? And there's less of that this year than I have sensed or felt through let's say my first 3 years here, especially.
Yeah. Week one, didn't answer all the questions. We saw a lot of good things, but I think that, and this will lead us right into Alabama, Texas. This week will tell us a lot more, I think, just certain matchup wise. I don't know that this is going to be the be all end all. If one receiver has a big game, I don't know that automatically means he's the dude. And we'll get into some of those matchups there. But it was very intriguing. It'll be very intriguing to kind of watch Saturday. Texas likes to do a lot of spread stuff. Everybody knows how Sark likes to run his offense, get the playmakers the ball in space and let them do their thing. So, it'll be kind of interesting to see the contrast in offenses, because Alabama fans know how Sark does his thing. I think they're still getting used to what Tommy Rees is doing, or at least what he's added to what Nick Saban wants to do this season. And we saw a little bit of it. A lot of tight ends on the field. Took some deep shots in the second half, not so much in the first half, maybe a couple deep passes, but it was interesting. I thought it was very vanilla. And so it's, leading into this second week, be kind of interesting to see what they do. And so maybe that's the transition now into Alabama, Texas, week 2, 11th ranked Longhorns. They beat Rice 37-10. Alabama obviously thumped Middle Tennessee. Maybe we should start here. And I know we're just transitioning off the wide receiver conversation, Mike, but what's the most intriguing matchup, or what intrigues you the most about this game overall between Alabama and Texas?
Yeah, I think it's Texas's receivers against Alabama's secondary. Again, it's not a head-to-head battle between Alabama's receivers and Texas's receivers, but I think Texas has the better skill position players. Granted, the running back position, there's a drop-off there for Texas, having lost Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson. They do have Keelan Robinson, the former Alabama running back, but a little bit more to prove, I think, for them at running back. But it's going to be these wide receivers against this secondary. I don't think they're quite even close to the LSU level of 2019 with Joe Burrow and Chase and what they were able to do. Justin Jefferson coming in here to Tuscaloosa. But there's some potential there from Texas. Again, I think the ceiling on Xavier Worthy is higher than what Alabama has at that position. The ceiling on Quinn Ewers is higher than what Alabama has at that position right now. And there was issues. I remember 2019, both inside linebackers were out with injuries in terms of, Dylan Moses and Josh McMillan going down. You had a freshman and Christian Harris starting. You had a freshman and Shane Lee starting that game against LSU, and LSU took advantage of it, the whole day, took advantage of, some of the issues in the Alabama secondary that year too. So it's dangerous having Sark coming in with, an offense that's already shown a little against this defense last year, and then having either Malachi Moore and Jalen Key play, or they play, but they're not 100%, or they don't play at all. And either way, I don't know if you're talking about a fully healthy group of safeties, those two plus Caleb Downs. And then, it's a big task for Terrion Arnold, who I think there's been a lot of positive momentum for him compared to, kind of him losing his job in the middle of last year. But, how does he perform? I think Kool-Aid and, maybe Caleb Downs, you can trust them. Even Caleb Downs as a freshman, you think you can trust them in this situation, but there's a lot of potential on the Texas side of the ball, and a lot of potential to start calling plays. And again, I don't think it's necessarily LSU coming in here and just ripping through this defense that they did 4 years ago. But yeah, it's. I think this is going to be more than a 20-point game like it was last year.
I'm very intrigued to see what Texas does against Alabama's defense, because Alabama's defense is not Rice, but Rice did a lot of. So I'm a sicko, and I rewatched the Texas Rice game last night just to see if there was anything I could pick up. And you pick up a few things when you watch stuff like that. I know it's week one. Coaches are really vanilla. Not that they're holding plays, but it's like it's the first week. It's the most basic install. Let's kind of see what we have here. Sark's offense, a lot of pre-snap motion. Get the ball to his playmakers in space. Struggled with deep shots, but I mean, it was very apparent that they were force feeding a guy like Xavier Worthy. So, I don't know that Saban ever has a cornerback follow a receiver, but does Kool-Aid just follow Worthy? Probably not. The other thing I think I'm really intrigued about, so I get to finish that thought. Communication in the secondary is going to be key, which is what makes, Malachi Moore and Jalen Key, like, are they going to play? How much are they going to play if they do? I think that will be very crucial to Alabama's defense. On top of that, I think Alabama, there was a lot of respect paid to Bijan Robinson last year. And I wonder how much, because Sark knew that Alabama had to respect him, how much did that open up a lot more of the offense? Now that there's not a Bijan in that backfield, like, how much does that allow for a little bit more flexibility for Alabama's defense? How much is it just, let's put Deontay Lawson on the running back and play with the other 10 guys? And then on top of that, the pass rush, I think, is super important too, because if Alabama can get pressure on Quinn Ewers, I don't think it matters who their receivers are, right? Which is really, that's an intriguing part too, because I think intriguing because Rice got some pressure on Texas last week. Like, they did some good stuff, putting Quinn Ewers in situations where he was just uncomfortable. We saw last year when Texas played Alabama, that first quarter when Ewers went like 9 of 12 for, 100 plus yards or whatever it was, and it looked like he was about to carve up Alabama's defense. It was quick snap, first read, go. Like, he did not waste any time. He got the ball out quickly. Obviously, when you got Will Anderson and Dallas Turner blitzing off the edge, like, you need to get the ball out fast. Can Alabama's, secondary cover well enough to make Ewers go to his second read, or can the pass rush get home fast enough and kind of learn from what Rice did to make Ewers uncomfortable? Because if you get in his face and you pressure him, he's not good. He's not good. Like, the stats show that when he's under pressure, he is just a totally different quarterback than when he is, perfectly protected. So some of that's duh. But I wonder how much that'll play into, the Texas receivers having a big day against Alabama secondary, which is entirely possible if, Sark does what, we know that he's capable of doing.
Yeah, and that was a quiet game for Will Anderson last year too. Probably maybe his worst game of the season. He had a couple penalties too, and people were down on him after that one. But yeah, I mean, that pass rush that we saw from Middle Tennessee State, or against Middle Tennessee State, was what they need. I mean, Dallas Turner, Braswell, Quandarius Robinson all combining. And you're right, you might be able to go lighter. They ran a lot of 3 defensive linemen type of sets against Middle Tennessee State. Sometimes they do that. Sometimes they only go 2. Alabama will, and you play 2 your edge guys instead, with the 2 defensive linemen, with your 2 inside guys, and then you run your nickel behind that. And I can see that being their approach for this game. I think it'll be interesting to see in the secondary. Let's say Moore and Key don't play, hypothetically. Is it Christian Story who starts at that safety spot? I would imagine so. He was the guy who came in when Key was hurt in this past game. Devontae Smith doesn't seem like he's close yet to returning from his foot injury. I think he would have been the guy. And then what do you do at star? They've tried to train Terry and Arnold to play there. Even in their dime package on Saturday in the opener, they moved Arnold inside and put Trey Amos outside. So I could see that being their strategy if Moore can't play in the slot, having Kool-Aid and Trey Amos outside, 2 veteran guys, and then Arnold inside on the slot think they might trust him more than Earl Little, who's technically the backup star, but hasn't really played too much on defense. For a game like this, maybe you want a couple guys in there who have played a lot more college football, and Trey Amos certainly has. So I'm interested to see what they do back there, but yeah, they're going to need some guys to get after Ewers, and going to need to shut down the running game so that doesn't become something that they have to be more and more concerned about as the game goes on, and try to make Texas one dimensional, and cover Worthy, Sanders, those guys one on one better than they did last year, because there was penalties, and they had the most penalties in school history, I think, in this game last year. Certainly the most in Saban era. And that was an issue between Brian Branch and Moore and Kool-Aid, and Kyrie Jackson was starting at corner in that game. So obviously something they need to do better this year.
Yeah. And I think that, I keep coming back to like the Tennessee game where Heupel did a lot of pre-snap motion and, move in, a guy like Jalen Hyatt, who's got world-class speed, into stacks. And it really just confused Alabama's secondary. And so I hear Saban throughout the preseason talking about, secondary communication and how those guys just need to be on the same page so that they don't, blow coverage like they did against Tennessee, or like they did against, LSU at times, or even Texas in that first quarter. Like, just, you can't get beat over the top against a team like this. So it makes me wonder, like, on that side of the ball, like, I think this is a pretty big Caleb Downs game. Like, because I think the other thing that Sark's going to want to do, in addition to getting his playmakers the ball, is let's test the young guy. Like, let's see if we can line up or get a specific matchup that pits, one-on-one. Let's put Downs in a situation that's going to stress him and see how he does. And if Texas wins, like, they'll obviously take it and they'll probably keep spamming it until Downs does otherwise. Or if Downs can win that matchup whenever it shows up, whether it's one-on-one or forcing him to make a decision one way or the other, if Downs is able to win that, then I think if you're Texas, you probably live with that decision, because you just want to test the young guy to see what he can do, right? So, yeah, I don't know. Like, there's a lot of intriguing parts about watching this Texas offense go up against this Alabama defense, because at times in rewatching the game, like, the Texas offense struggled quite a bit against Rice. Like, they struggled running the ball in short yardage situations. Their offensive line has been touted in very similar conversations to Alabama's offensive line, and we'll touch on that here in a minute, but not very impressive running the ball. They gave up a handful of sacks. They gave up a handful of pressures throughout the game. Eventually, as the game wore down, I think Texas finished with like 158 rushing yards, but like a lot of that came in, late third, fourth quarter, when they just wore down Rice, bigger, faster, stronger team. They ended up pulling away and winning. But I wonder what is Sark going to do to either counteract that? Is it just a discipline thing? So I don't know. Like, there's just a lot of interesting things. And I think this could be, a big game for Caleb Downs to prove that, he really is this dude that could play like Minka for Alabama for the next few years. I don't know. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's something where matchup wise, if you're looking at Sark, what personnel packages do I put on the field to have the best matchup? I could see him going a little bit heavier on wide receivers, trying to get Alabama into their obviously they're going to be a nickel a lot, but their dime. Especially if they don't have their full complement of players back there, and running, like you said, combinations that put stress on the safeties, and and Saban's defense is not easy to run as a defensive back. I mean, the pattern matching and the recognition things that they need to do before the snap, and as guys are released from the line, and passing guys off, and picking which guys to cover. I mean, it's not a straight man, it's not a straight zone. It's a complicated scheme for any defensive back to play. Again, all indications are that Caleb Downs has done a very good job picking that up, but Stark certainly knows the Saban defense, and from going against in practice for a couple of years, and I think can probably draw some things up that cause some decisions for guys that are difficult, on the fly, and the crowd noise too. It's potentially could be a factor for this secondary if the crowd's really into this game. When Texas is on the field offensively, then the pre-snap communication between the defensive backs does get hampered a little bit. That's just sort of a a hidden cost, if you will, of having a loud crowd for a game like this. And so, Downs and Kool-Aid and Arnold and those guys are all going to be communicating with hand signals, communicating back to the sideline with hand signals, and um, that's something they'll need to make sure that they're doing well. So it's that, and also if Texas tries to go fast, which sometimes does stress Alabama, that's also something that communication wise, especially if you're on the far side of the field, you're the corner away on the other side of the field trying to look back at the sideline. That's always a tough situation. And that's where Tennessee's hurt them. That's where Ole Miss has hurt them with their speed on offense. And um, again, I don't think Sark is ignorant to that, shall we say?
The other side of the ball, so we're talking Alabama's offense versus Texas defense, equally as intriguing because of all the things that jumped out in rewatching that Texas game. It's good defense, man. Like, this is early in the fourth quarter when the A team was on the field. Rice had 6 total rush yards, 4 total first downs, and 3 turnovers. They got some dudes in the middle of that defensive line. Tavondre Sweat is the main guy that Alabama is going to have to key in on everywhere. Jalen Ford is another opportunistic linebacker. It's a mean front seven. And so, I think back to Alabama's offensive line talking about how they want to make people quit, how they want to be dominant. I don't know that we saw that against Middle Tennessee. Like, they were good. They weren't great. Like, if you want to make a team quit, Middle Tennessee is probably the team you want to make quit. But this Texas team is going to be a different type of challenge. And in the same vein that I think Sark might test the freshman Caleb Downs, Texas offense versus Alabama's defense, I think Caden Proctor in the same way. Like, this could be a big game for him. Like, I think he's going to get tested quite a bit because he, again, against Middle Tennessee, he played good. There were no glaring misses, but he missed a few reps here and there, didn't finish a couple blocks. Jalen Milroe took a couple of hits because, Proctor didn't just hang on to his man for an extra split second after a throw. I wonder how much, and Texas did a lot of blitzing against Rice. So I wonder if they'll just, is this a game where they, he's the freshman, he's the weak link. Let's load up and see if we can blitz on that side to try and get, Milroe out of the pocket and out of rhythm a little bit. I think that could be another interesting battle to watch in this game, specifically when you flip, Alabama's offense versus Texas defense. Cause everybody was talking about Alabama's offensive line versus Texas defensive line last week during the Middle Tennessee game, as a matchup to watch in this week 2 game. But I think specifically, it wouldn't surprise me at all if Texas just decided to go after Proctor until, the same way we were talking about Downs, prove that you can stop it, kid. Right. And so I think that's maybe a big thing to watch. What do you think?
Yeah, and part of it's Milroe too. That's something I think you even noted in your notes after the game that Jordan Rogers was commenting on Milroe needing to shift protections or handle things better at the line when he got sacked twice. And even though as the running back, in pass protection there, and Jam Miller got blown up on one of those, part of it still lies on Milroe in order to get guys in the right spots and, check out of the play or whatever the case may be. And that's something, it's going to be tougher to do against Texas than Middle Tennessee State. Texas it's a big boy defense and, big boy defensive coordinator coming in. And it's going to be a little bit more complicated. So that's something that, I'm wondering too, if there'll be any changes on the Alabama offensive line. I know we've seen some different looks from the practice tape that they, graciously allow us to view on Mondays and Tuesdays. With Terrence Ferguson was at left guard and one of them next to Proctor, next to McLaughlin, suggesting he was with the first team. And I know that was one of the things we saw early in camp, but then they said Ferguson wasn't quite as good with giving Proctor what he needed to know on the outside, and they moved Booker back to the left. Is there a benefit to putting Booker on the right next to JC Latham, and then you have probably your 2 best defensive line or offensive linemen on the right side, and can you run behind those guys who combined are about 700 pounds? And does that give you an advantage putting those 2 guys together from a running game standpoint on the right side, and having a strength where you can hand off to Jace McClellan, who's a pretty physical guy, have 2 linemen you trust, and you start to kind of build a path forward on that side. So there's different ways to attack it. But yeah, this is a game where the offensive line is going to need to prove that it's the sort of strength and asset to the team that they think they can be this year, and they've talked about wanting to be. So, yeah, that's the key for the Alabama offense. I think is going to be the offensive line and the pass protection, but also how effectively can they run the ball and how much stress can they take off Jalen Milrow to be throwing the ball and trying to do more than what honestly a lot of people think he's capable of doing against a good team. I mean, that's just the reality with him is that people don't think he's a great passer, and maybe he can prove that. But the less you can put yourself in that spot where you're trying to make Jalen Milrow prove it, I think is better for him.
Yeah. Obviously, I'm going to be curious to see how they help Proctor, what they do with the offensive line. They ran a lot of 12 personnel last week. Do they continue to do that? Maybe use one of those tight ends to, chip help off the edge, help Proctor a little bit here and there. Like, do you take Robbie Oots and just like install him as like the honorary left tackle, just to help with whatever rush Texas is going to send that way? The other thing too is like, how do you, Texas did a lot of blitzing against Rice. How do you do that? Well, do you take advantage of that and run a lot of screens? Don't know that we saw hardly any screens against Middle Tennessee. That could have just been a product of not installing them yet. What intrigues you the most when Alabama has the ball against Texas? What's the most intriguing matchup to you? Is it the offensive line, or what are the other things you're going to be watching?
First of all, I think some of the bubble screens might have gone north with Bill O'Brien. He loved those. And they weren't, again, they didn't really have the guys to run them last year. So a lot of those weren't terribly successful. I don't know how we'll see nearly as much as those with Tommy Rees. But, I think part of it, like if the tight end position is a strength or better than it has been for this Alabama offense, which I think it is, how can they use that to their advantage? And you have four guys that we cycled through all four of them in that game, the opener. And it's tricky sometimes because I think you put Robbie Oots out there and you put Danny Lewis out there, it kind of screams run because those are your run blockers, and then Nyblack and Dupree are the guys you're going to throw the ball to. So if you have both of them out there, you're declaring pass. What I think they're trying to do is put them together. You have Lewis and Nyblack or Dupree and Oots, and you have two tight ends out there, but they're doing two different things, and that doesn't really declare as much pre-snap. So that's something, it's like actually Sark used a lot of tight ends. He always liked to run pretty big protection packages where it's like 8-man protection, and Alabama would put in Kendall Randolph as a sixth offensive lineman and use him as a blocker. They'd have another tight end in there blocking, and they'd have the running back blocking, and then they'd have two receivers on the outside that were just better than the guys they were going against, and you had a quarterback who could get them the ball. It's different now. Like you can put the two tight ends in there and have a big protection and try to keep the pass rush at bay, but it's still a question of, can Jalen Milrow get the ball to Jermaine Burton and Isaiah Bond, or Jermaine Burton and Ja'Cory Brooks, whoever it is, or Malik Benson, and can those guys win their one-on-one matchups? So it's one of those things. It's like we've been saying all offseason, we'll just have to see, but truly we'll just have to see. Like, this is the first real game, quote unquote, that these guys have all been together for, with Reese and Milrow and this receiver group.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I like the way that they kind of mixed and matched those tight ends, because I was kind of worried about the same thing. Like, if you put, Nyblack and Dupree out there, like, yes, pass, but I guess that's why throughout the preseason I was kind of screaming like, hey, like, these guys need to prove, and it was more at like Oots and Lewis, just because we haven't seen it yet. These guys have to prove that they can be viable, reliable pass catchers, because like we know in theory they can all block. I think Nyblack missed a few blocking assignments in the first week, but otherwise they all showed competency in that part of their game. So if they can all prove to be reliable pass catchers, you trot 12 personnel out there and the defense has no idea what to expect. They could load up, go jumbo, and run the ball. Or they can, play action pass, and then the defense is having to react. This could be a game where, maybe we see some of that at long last. I don't know that we saw a ton of that. I didn't pay too close attention to the running game against Middle Tennessee, but they also, I think it left a little bit to be desired. Like, it's not like they were just mowing people down in the run game. And Texas ain't going to let you mow them down, because those are some big bodies and some fast linebackers. So be really curious to see how that unfolds. That'll be an intriguing matchup. I guess one of my last questions for you is which of these matchups that we've kind of discussed And we've kind of bounced all over the place. But which of these matchups do you think will be the biggest in deciding Saturday's game?
Yeah, Texas wide receivers, Alabama secondary. I think that's where it starts, and that could be where it ends too. But it's yeah, I think from a big picture standpoint too, like it's people. We can get into this, the whole aspect of you win this game. What does it mean? Um, I think for Alabama, there's going to be a lot more optimism that this is a national championship team than there probably was this offseason. Um, there's still the entire SEC schedule ahead of them. There's still some tough road trips, A&M and Auburn, that will still be on their schedule. But I think there's going to be a lot of talk of, is Alabama back, or is Alabama still here, or whatever you want to term it as. And and the flip side, Alabama loses this game. It's definitely another conversation of, is the dynasty dead? Which again, it comes up every time they lose. In this case, it's you're talking 5 losses in the past season, or past 2 seasons plus 2 games, and that's different than how things were. So it's consequential. It's a consequential game, and again, there's a lot of people watching it. There's a lot of people paying attention. There's going to be a lot of NFL scouts in the press box. So for we talk about, or Nick Saban talked about Jermaine Burton's future as a player. Like, this is a big one for him, being a senior, and the people watching him, and we know Dallas Turner and Kool-Aid um, and JC Latham are all getting the draft attention, but this could also go a long way to getting some of these other guys some money in the NFL. This game could, because that's what NFL scouts want to watch, is how do you stack up against good competition in a big stage like this. So that's another aspect that's going to be important. But I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a good game. I really would be surprised if this is like a 30-point game, one direction or the other.
Yeah, I think, what were we saying last night when we were, the group of us were sitting there waiting for Saban to come in? And, I think there's a world where Texas wins. I think, but I have a hard time picturing Texas running them out of the building. On the flip side, there's a world where I think Alabama can run them out of the building. If they just all come out 5 stars across the board and just play the A game of all A games. I don't know how likely that possibility is. I think maybe one final thought to maybe wrap up this conversation is I think it's a big game for the freshmen, Caleb Downs and Caden Proctor. What you got against a team that's very, very good. But then I also think it's another big Milroe game, right? Like, he had a fantastic first test against Middle Tennessee, but it was Middle Tennessee. This is Texas. They've got a nasty front seven. They've got better athletes all over the field. I think this dude is going to have to make some plays, be it with his arm, be it with his feet. If he can make a few plays here and there, I think that's what will ultimately help Alabama win this game. If he can't make those plays, I don't know that means Alabama will lose the game, but the margin for error for everybody else is just non-existent. If, do we get Milroe from last week, or do we get the Milroe that played in the A&M game last year?
Mm-hmm.
I think that'll be an interesting thing to watch, and it'll be interesting to see how the offense operates. It'll be interesting to see kind of, what's your follow-up performance, the difference between these guys that, can contend for a national title and the guys that don't, is the consistency of their play. And so, can Milroe come out and do it again? Be very intrigued to watch that. I said this before we hit recording. I'll say it as kind of, an ender here. In watching the Texas Rice game, I don't know that this Texas team can win a national title, but I do think they're plenty good enough to beat Alabama if the Crimson Tide are not ready to go on Saturday night. So I think it's going to be a really intriguing game. You got any final thoughts before we sign off here?
Turnovers. I think turnovers are, you list them as key to a game, any game, but particularly a close game between really good 2 teams like this. And it was something that was an issue for Alabama last year, defensively, even, forcing turnovers. They did a better job of that against Middle Tennessee, and preventing turnovers on offense. Milroe did a better job of that when he started in this opener compared to what he did last year.
2 hands on the ball.
That's right. Yeah, he had the fumbles last year. He had the interceptions interception against A&M. So that's if he can avoid that, then yeah, it puts him in a better spot. Like I said, that's kind of where their offense needs to be, is a little bit more controlled and shorten the game and run the ball and not turn it over. If you get into a shootout where you're throwing interceptions back and forth and all that, it's just I have a harder time picturing Alabama winning that sort of game against Texas. That's just me.
It would be kind of fun though to see, like, hey, Tommy Rees, what you got? Like, if they go into a shootout, like what's in that playbook that you can just unload in the fourth quarter as teams like that are going back and forth? Be interesting.
Yeah.
That is, I think that's all we got. Mike, I appreciate you joining me. I wrote a story earlier this week about the last time Texas came to Tuscaloosa, which was very, very different. So be sure to check that out at Bama 247, our Texas site at 247 Sports. So be sure, Apple, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk again soon.